Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Everyday Equity, Everyday Ways to Make a Change. Your host here is Pooja Kothari. I'm the founder of Boundless Awareness, and we provide anti oppression trainings and curriculum to nonprofits, universities, and companies. With me here today is a guest that I've been so excited to have. Kuheli Dutt is the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. I'm so happy to see you, Kuheli. We met so many years ago at the Earth Institute, and I was so grateful to have met you then, to have read your research, to include it in my trainings, and just to be connected with you. Welcome, and I'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Thank you, and likewise. So I work. My name is Kuheli Dutt. I use she/her pronouns. I'm currently the assistant dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion at MIT's School of Science. This is a role I've held for about 3 years now. But prior to that, I was at Columbia University at the Earth Institute and Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory for about 14 years. And in fact, that's where Pooja and I first met. And so in my line of work, there are various levels of like diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff that I do broadly, which touches a wide range of things that I'm happy to chat about later.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'd love to start asking you, why is anti-oppression work or DEI work or unconscious bias work or all the ways that we can say it? Why is it important to you? When did it start becoming a part of your like career, professional life? Did it start with research, and then how did it lead you to the position you're in today?
So there were a few different steps, I think, initially in terms of this radar, in terms of it being on my radar. I think it started when I was an undergraduate in India, and that's where, there's a lot of intersection of like caste and class and socioeconomic status. And so those areas around privilege and, and oppression, the other side of it, were on my radar around then. And then when I came to the US for graduate school, my PhD was actually in public policy, where I looked at certain areas like race and gender and same-sex marriage and other areas that are very relevant to this. And so that's how academically it was on my radar. In terms of the actual work experience in this, it started really long ago. When I was at Columbia University. So they were one of the early institutions, and I'm talking like back in 2007. So way back then, they were one of the early organizations that, hired like a designated institutional DEI officer. Specifically, I was hired for the Lamont campus, which is the geoscience campus of Columbia. And the idea there being that, clearly in the field of the geosciences, there's a lot of, it's very, or at least when we started back then, it was a very certain demographic. It was typically, white male was the white hetero cis body, cisgender able-bodied white male was sort of the sort of default demographic. And in fact, the question that when someone says, when you envision a geologist, who do you see? And that's usually the first image that comes to mind. And so at that point, they had, as part of the NSF Advanced program, they had realized that in order to truly address these issues and advance and make progress in them, they needed to hire somebody whose full-time job it was to address these sorts of things. And so that was back in 2007. So that was like, 17 years ago that Columbia did this. And in that space, I began to see a lot of things that I would say was probably most closely resonates with the idea of unconscious bias. It's something that we all have. It's like we all have certain ideas of what it means. Like, what does a scientist look like? What does a boss look like? What does, a janitor look like? We all have unconscious associations. And I don't even know if bias is the right word sometimes, but it's an association we have. And I saw those getting played out in many different ways, as you would in any field that is very homogenous. And given the areas of work that I was doing, their areas of involvement, so I was the DEI person, the student affairs person, the academic affairs and diversity inclusion person. So I wore many hats because it was a very small campus. And looking at the intersection of how all of those worked, it kind of got me into the space of thinking about it in a professional level. And because I was also involved in things like uh, promotion committees and faculty search processes and research scientist search processes, I also had access to data firsthand in terms of applicants, letters of recommendation, and things like that. So it was a combination of my day-to-day administrative work guiding my research, and my research being guided by day-to-day administrative work. On the topic of racism in particular, I was pretty astounded to find that that was just not on the radar of geosciences. Like, it was something that when I wrote my paper on race and racism in the geosciences, like, it's been 4 years now, but back then I scoured every single geoscience journal I could possibly get my hands on, and it was the same story again and again. Like, either there was nothing about any DEI type of subject, or if it was usually framed in sort of a pedagogical way, like learning outcomes or something like that for a certain subject for certain groups of people. But the topic of race and racism was just not something that was addressed at all. It was just not a single article around those themes. So that was what made me realize the importance of actually devoting time and attention to that.
Mm, yeah. When you said, growing up in India and just being so conscious about caste and class, and then talking about Columbia's initiatives in 2007, a lot of people, we're in 2024, almost 2025, a lot of people, their awakening was 2020. Or, when I say, oh, I started Boundless Awareness 8 years ago, they're like, oh, in 2016, the people were doing this. And so there's a very short memory when we're talking about DEI work. You have been doing this work for so long. Your consciousness has been awakened from a very young age. Can you talk to me about your earliest memories of why anti-oppression work, even if you didn't call it that, why it was meaningful to you, and how did it awaken your consciousness? What were the circumstances there?
Yeah, so, growing up in India, I mean, there's already, gender issues. In many ways, it's a very patriarchal society. And so that was something that we kind of normalized growing up. I was fortunate that my parents, are both very progressive. And so there was very, they were very, that was sort of the liberal progressive Indian upbringing that I had. But then I went to this college for undergraduate, my undergraduate work, that was known as sort of this feminist college of India. It was like an all women's college. It was extremely known to be like, and in those days, of course, maybe even now, anyone who sort of fought against the established patriarchal order was labeled a troublemaker. And so the college that I went to, Lady Shri Ram College, or for short form we called it LSR, was often labeled as a troublemaking college, and so on. And because, yeah, so we went, it was a badge we wore very proudly of being, troublemakers.
Mhm.
But it was mostly from a very feminist lens rather than all other, other types of
Mm.
oppression. And I think one of the things that, as we started to, as I started to engage in those conversations, a few things that came up were caste and class. And one of the things in India that is very common is that the people who do the menial work, such as the janitorial work or the custodial staff, they tend to be people predominantly from the lower classes and lower castes. And we had an initiative in college, and I think this was probably one of my earliest or strongest, earliest instances where I remember a really strong impact. We had this event called uh, Shramdan, which literally in Hindi translates into like donating labor. And so for a certain, I think it was a 2 day period or something like that, a 3 day period, the students did all the physical work of what all of the custodial staff did. So we swept the floors, we cleaned the toilets, we basically did all of that work for the whole campus. And I think that was probably a pivotal moment in what we realized, that how much we take for granted, how much we assume that the things that we don't have to do, that that others do for us, and that is done for us in a way that we don't are not necessarily familiar with the challenges and struggles of groups that have known that sort of oppression, specifically caste and class oppression. So that was kind of, I would say, my aha awakening moment. And then, of course, as I came to the U.S., those areas are perhaps not as relevant here as other things such as racism or sexism, or those in that space.
Yeah, it's making visible the invisible labor that I
Mm-hmm.
think we all rely on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And so, when I think about, South Asian cultures and dynamics and oppressions, the colorism sticks out to me, the sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, and it's almost like, and of course, casteism is the biggest, uh, uh, biggest meaning. It's an oppression that people that it's so normalized that when you're not part of the oppressed caste, it seems like it's okay. Caste, yeah, caste exists. Yeah, that's why those people do XYZ. That's why we people are over here. And it's so normalized that it's like, of course, that's how it is. And my question is, where is it easier, or with whom is it, which culture is it easier to talk about um, all of these oppressions? Is it easier in South Asian society because there are some things that are so glaringly obvious, like the patriarchal society? Or is it easier here, like in the circles like at Columbia or MIT,
Mm-hmm.
to challenge people on anti-oppression work? And maybe easier isn't the right qualifier, but
Yeah.
yeah, the awareness levels, I guess, is
Yeah,
what.
yeah. I think it's probably a bit of both. I think so. There's this really amazing book called Caste, written by Isabel Wilkerson, and I would strongly recommend, reading that. And if in any audience here, I would really strongly recommend reading that. What it does, what Wilkerson does in her book, is she looks at three areas. One is racism in the U.S., caste in India, and Nazi Germany. And it's uncanny how she draws all the parallels, just basically all based on the fact that certain groups of people are more privileged or viewed as with a certain higher status compared to others. And to answer your specific question, I would say that, very much like how you said that, oh yeah, it's so normalized, in South Asia, that caste is something that, yeah, it's there, but it's really not a big deal. In much the same way, I would say in the US, a lot of white people were talking about caste up until this whole, larger awareness. It was more like, yeah, I mean, yeah, race is there. It's not a thing. Like, so usually what you would have is the privileged class, like whether in India it's the upper caste people, or whether in the US it's, white people, or, white or white passing in some instances, where when they haven't personally experienced something and only have a theoretical knowledge of this is how it is and it's normalized a certain way around them, they don't necessarily have a sense of how it might impact someone who is actually in the oppressed group of that particular identity.
Mm.
And I think, in terms of who it's easier to talk to, I think, again, this is strictly my experience. I would say that people who are receptive to it, I'd say, have been more progressive. Like, they're more able to sort of look at, this, look at this larger issue in terms of what it means for society, and looking at years of how it came into being. So I think that is a little bit easier to talk about, because sometimes, if you whether it's the topic of race or caste, if you bring it up, with someone who isn't receptive to that mindset, there's an accusation that they're being blamed about something. So, there's that tricky element as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the most brilliant aspects of white supremacy is to tie individuals
Mm.
to the individual's sense of goodness to the idea of being not racist.
Yeah.
How I'm not racist, I'm a good person. That's not, those are two distinct things that are actually have nothing to do with each other.
Correct.
They're actually completely irrelevant. And but it's the brilliance of white supremacy to stop the forward progress of anti-racist movements, because you just get everybody on the defensive, and you all the gears get stuck, and you just can't move forward because people are really intent on proving on how good of a person you are, they are. So in that vein, when you hear defensiveness or excuses to not engage in anti-oppression work, not to engage in DEI work, we don't need that. We're all good people. People don't have any issues here in our organization. I don't have any complaints. So when you hear excuses to not engage, what are some of the ways you go about responding to that? Or maybe programs that you've thought of to, like, programming to get people more engaged. Um, what are your in all of your years of
Yeah.
experience? What are your ways to talk about it?
So I think there are a few different strategies that I've used over the years, and a few different angles coming from a few different spaces. So one of the most common things I hear, and again, this is well-intentioned people. Like, I'm not suggesting people mean badly, but they will say things like, "Oh, why do we need to think about race or gender? Let's just focus on merit."
Mm.
And that sort of an argument makes the assumption that anytime you're looking into unconscious bias or oppression, somehow you are taking away from merit. And another default assumption is that a professor is a white male, or something. That's sort of the default thing, and that's the normal hire. But if it's somebody, a woman who's an excellent candidate, or a person of color who's an excellent candidate, then that is more likely to be labeled as a quote unquote diversity hire. So I very gently point out that to them in a way that says, oh, like, the implication here is that normal hire means it's going to be a white male, but anybody else is a diversity hire. And so when you talk about merit, like, we, all of these people we hire do have merit, and that's why they got hired. Like, they were not hired because of their race or because of their gender. They were hired because they were suited for the job. And when we talk about larger issues around unconscious bias, then, the research documents the ways in which uh, women or people of color, or non-majority groups are perceived in a way that minimizes their contribution to science or minimizes their contribution. For example, there's so much research, including my own research, that talks about how when we're describing male scientists, we use words like genius and star. And when you're describing female scientists, you will use words like reliable and nurturing and team player. So there, one is I point that out to people. The other thing I do is sometimes I sort of turn it around and I move away from the more politically sensitive topics like race or gender, and I move it, sort of turn it onto myself, and I talk about, like, I give examples where, say, I made a mistake because I didn't know any better. And in one example I often give, and sometimes I start unconscious bias sessions with this example, is that one time, and this, I was brand new at MIT, and I was rushing to attend. It was an in-person DEI seminar somewhere, and I was rushing to attend it. And MIT, to those who are familiar with the buildings, can be a maze. Like, you could get lost very easily and very quickly. So my only focus was, and I was brand new there, my only focus was, how do I get from my office to this particular spot where the workshop is happening, and, finding my way there. And I felt very proud of myself when I, found my way to that workshop venue. And it was a time where it was an DEI slash orientation session. So many people were new, and many people had that exact same mindset, like, walking through the maze that is MIT and getting lost. How do we find our way to that venue? And feeling very happy that we did, which was all very well. But then the presenter said something to us, and she said that as you were rushing to get here, how many of you took the time to notice where the wheelchair access ramps were to the building or where the disability access ramps were, the entrances were. And the answer was that none of us had taken the time to notice. And we didn't because we didn't need to. And that was an example of able bodied privilege. Like, I didn't need to say, where are the wheelchair ramps that will get me from my office to the workshop venue, because I didn't need to do that. And so that was really a nice way, I thought, of introducing this concept that when something is not on our radar and we haven't known adversity as a result of that particular thing, whether it is race or whether it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, disability, whatever that social identity is, then often that thing is not something we automatically pay attention to. So when I hear, comments about why do we need to do this, I'll give them those examples and say, unless these things are put on your radar, you're not going to look for them because they've never been sources of adversity to you. So,
Yeah.
and then sometimes we'll just go out and do certain workshops and initiatives or programs that get people involved so that they can see that there really is an urgency to do this work.
Yeah. 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 Brilliant. Brilliant. I love that example. Um, it also reminds me of your article where you analyze like recommendation letters and the words and adjectives, like you were saying, of people who um, uh, ask for a reference or a recommendation letter from a former professor and what adjectives they use. Again, it has nothing to do with merit. It's all about the associations and biases of, how are you going to describe a scientist who's a woman, and how are you going to describe a scientist who's a man? And you're not even aware in your reference, it could be a glowing recommendation letter, but you're not using the same words. And it has an
Exactly.
inherent disparate effect. And these,
Absolutely.
I think, were like international. You
It was a
analyze.
huge data set. We
Yeah.
analyzed different world regions. It was like some 1,200 letters. And the thing is, initially we thought, the reason we grouped it out by different world regions is because we thought maybe there are differences in different world regions. And, you know, I mean, in terms of statistical analysis, the good news was they were all similar. Social identity was the same thing. And regardless of which world region we looked at, male scientists were described in stronger language than female scientists.
Yeah.
And the only real differences we found in world regions were things like, the length of the letter or, that sort of thing. Like, for example, in the US, those tended to be longer. But outside of those kind of technical details in terms of the content, it was just very much like, every region of the world was doing the exact same thing. And the other really key thing that we found, like, amazing, like just amazing, like not in a good sense, but like, whoa, we were struck by it, is that it wasn't just male letter writers who were doing this. Both male and female letter writers were doing this. So letter writers across the board were writing, using stronger language or certain types of language when they were describing men as opposed to women, even though they were writing really wonderful letters for those women applicants as well. So it wasn't like a bad letter. It was like, this is a wonderful person,
Yeah.
so hardworking, so intelligent, great team player, that kind of thing. But it was what we were not picking up on as, okay, we don't see the word brilliant or genius or trailblazer or star as we see more frequently in letters for male applicants.
Yeah. Yeah. We internalize all of that impression, and then we just exhale it back out into the world. And if we're not, if people are like, what, everything's fine. Like, I judge people based on their character and their actions, and I don't judge anywhere else. It's just not possible. This illusion of objectivity or neutrality as a human being is um, almost laughable, because we are so
Yeah.
subjective inherently. I mean, you need these strict like research methods in order to take all of that subjectivity out of research. So to think that we're immune to it, or anybody's immune to it, or can write a recommendation letter that is gender neutral or race, it's funny. It's just a funny concept. It's a pie in the sky. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Um, Okay, in the remaining minutes, we did just have an election this week. There is a lot going on. My question is, considering where we know where we're going to be for the next 4 years, and having been in a similar place from 2016 to 2020, um, what's the role universities should take, and let's limit it to the universities that do have offices where there are deans of inclusion, and it's departments are there and the structures there. What's the next steps universities should be taking?
So I think that in the, both the current political climate and just over the last few years or so, I think the DEI in general has come under a lot of backlash. That's sort of in ways or the other, like whether different rulings against LGBTQ folks, whether it is the Supreme Court affirmative action ruling, whether it's just a general climate, I would say, where there is a lot of backlash against DEI and those sorts of activities. So I think, given that backdrop, and also I would say right now we're in this time that feels very polarizing, that feels very, and we've seen this happen, like whether it's political ideology, whether it's the current last year, with the whole Israeli-Palestine conflict and how it played out on college campuses. So there was a lot going on that was political in nature, but had a very real impact on, the our university community and people in the university. So I think, in terms of, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but in terms of what my office and what we have done, I would say the School of Science, is our focus has been very much to sort of focus heavily on the inclusion piece, the belonging piece, the transparency and equity, those kinds of pieces of it. So rather than do some of the more the sort of things that are very specific around a particular group or race, it's more about our office or our community. How do we make sure that everyone feels included? How do we make sure that everyone feels like their voice is heard? So MIT does this thing every 2 years. It's a huge thing. It's called the Quality of Life Survey, and they ask all kinds of questions. It's like, I think, 57 broad questions, many of which have subparts across different roles, gender, race, background, everything. So every year, every time that they do this survey, which is every 2 years, like you have several thousand like several thousand graphs just from that, looking at different roles
Mm,
intersecting with race and gender. And one of the things we're doing, that our focus is, and I would encourage anyone who does anti-oppression work to also do something similar, is be guided by the data, like which are the populations that are saying that they're feeling isolated or they're not feeling heard, which are the populations that are saying that they are not feeling recognized or they don't feel valued for the work that they do. Which, and it could be like, to give you a broad example, it might not even be anything specific to race or gender. Like one of our most, I would say, one of the things that was an eye opener for me was that among the different roles, in terms of different classes of positions, postdoctoral scientists reported being the most isolated, reported
yeah.
having the highest stress levels, reported feeling not valued. And this is just a group, like it's a title, postdoctoral scientist. So this transcends something like race or gender. But the focus, what I want to sort of get back to is, you know, do your research in terms of who is your community, how are they feeling served, whether it's via a survey or whether it's checking in with them. And then when groups of people are saying that they're not feeling seen or heard or valued, take some action to address that. Because I mean, we at some point we have to say, all right, there are certain things that are happening outside of our university community or outside of MIT that we have no control over. The only thing we can actually control is what's going on within our community that we have the power to address or take action for. And framing it around who's feeling seen and heard and valued or included, who's feeling like they're part of this community, those things have been what have really guided us, and transparency around everything that we do.
Yeah, I mean, to get the gauge and the pulse of the community is uh I think there's a lot of organizations that want to close their eyes to the discord that is happening, and it's just not smart for the long run or even the medium term. Kuheli, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been, I mean, I could talk to you for hours. This has been, there's just so many threads we could talk about.
Right.
But this is one of many of Kuheli's articles. Please read it. It's much of it is still relevant today. I mean, it's only been 4 years, and there's so much going on. So, thank you, thank you so much.
Thank you
And
for having me.
yes, yes, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Take care.
Bye bye.